Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The American Idea, brought to you by the Ashbrook Center. My name is John Moser. I'm chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Ashland University, home of the Ashbrook Center. And the subject of today's talk is the Iranian hostage crisis, which began in November of 1979. We are going to be talking about it today with Dr. Greg Schneider. Greg is a professor of history and executive director of government relations at Emporia State University. He teaches when he has time for teaching and he's not engaged in government relations. He teaches courses on modern American history, the 1960s, diplomatic history, the history of railroads, and the history of American conservatism. He has published 5 books: Cadres for Conservatism, Young Americans for Freedom and the Rise of the Contemporary Right, Conservatism in America Since 1930, A Reader, Equality, Decadence, and Modernity, the collected essays of Stephen J. Tonser, The Conservative Century, From Reaction to Revolution, and Rock Island Requiem, The Collapse of a Mighty Fine Line. Greg, welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
Great pleasure, John.
Yeah. So the Iranian hostage crisis, it's a pretty important development. Could you kind of give us the background? What's going on in 1979 that brings this?
So I think there's a long history of this hostage crisis and the short history. Certainly the long history dates back to the problems of US-Iranian relations going back to when the Shah was installed in power and Mohammad Mossadegh was removed back in 1953. And that the U.S. played a role in that, as did the British, for interests of securing control over the Anglo-American oil company. And the Shah ruled for the next 26 years, pretty harshly, imposing, benefited personally from his rule over Iran. And increasingly, you saw protests emerge from a group of various groups, including the Communist Party in Iran. It's hard to imagine the Communist Party in Iran, given what's happened to Iran since 1979. But Islamic students, eventually by the 1970s, who were motivated by the writings and of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was exiled in 1964 and had to go to went to Iraq eventually, I think Turkey initially, Iraq, and then eventually Paris, where he comes back from in 1979. And a whole slew of other protests, given the Shah's kind of harsh rule. He had a secret police system, the SAVAK, which was pretty ruthless. And the United States supported him. Why wouldn't we? As Iran was on the southern border of the Soviet Union, and U-2 bases were there, and it was a good listening post for the United States. And by the 1970s, there was a lot of concern about the Shah's rule. But when Jimmy Carter's elected in 1976, that's not high on his list of priorities, certainly. And I think the administration's kind of caught off guard when the protests began to erupt even further in 1978 and 1979, and eventually the Shah is forced to leave the country and eventually gets refuge in the United States. So,
is it the case? I think neoconservatives in the late 1970s suggested that Carter was too much concerned about his human rights foreign policy and did not give the Shah the kind of support that he should have. Is there truth to that?
I think there's a little bit of truth to that, but Carter hosts the Shah, I think it's in 77 in the White House, and praises him and praises his rule. The Shah brings him this kind of beautiful tapestry featuring George Washington woven in Iran. And the Shah I mean, Carter publicly praises him, holds a toast to him. They have a state dinner for him and his wife. He is not exactly, again, not exactly on the highest list of priorities for Carter, but Carter's human rights strategy, which meant that you would start criticizing our allies, as Jeane Kirkpatrick, who wrote in the harassing commentary about this, and I think it's 1979, Carter doesn't distinguish between the totalitarian governments and the authoritarian governments. And the authoritarian governments, like the Shahs, could be amenable to reform, or totalitarian communist regimes could not be. And so Carter begins to focus attention on the Shah's rule, criticizing it, pushing for reforms, as well as the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, and both of those ostensible allies of the United States would collapse and lead to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has certainly not been in the best interest for the United States for the past 40 years, as well as the Sandinistas in Nicaragua.
Then let me ask you this. You said that there is a whole coalition, a whole bunch of different groups that are up in arms against the Shah by the end of the 1970s. How is it that the Islamists end up on top? Was this a surprising development, or did experts see this coming?
So I don't think any experts saw it coming. I think that there were certainly students who were, so it's kind of in a sense, it's a student movement towards Islamist kind of viewpoints that strengthens in Iran during the late 60s, and throughout the 1970s. And the Shah's secret police puts down some student-led protests at the holy city of, I think it's Qom, in 1977, that intensifies the student protests, as well as the activism and writings of Ayatollah Khomeini, who is exiled as early as, I said, in 1964, and is in Iraq at that time at the Shia holy city. And he's kind of fomenting this and pushing the idea that we need to have an Islamic state, an Islamic theocracy, that the Shah has encouraged too much westernization for the previous decade. In a pretty good book on this topic by David Farber about the roots of the Iranian crisis, I mean, he had some long interviews with students who were Western educated, but wind up embracing Khomeini's kind of Islamic ideas, because it seems to be a fresh kind of awakening for them about the evils of Western influence in Iran. So you're beginning to have kind of a break. I mean, what we were worried about, of course, in the Middle East for decades in the Cold War was the more secular elements of Muslim governments who were pro-Soviet, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and all the rest of them. We weren't worried about Islamic movements at all. So that it kind of catches the US off guard, certainly, as well as the Western world, I think.
Is this an indication that even at this point, the Cold War dynamic was beginning to break down?
Yeah, I think this is one of the first steps in that. I mean, certainly this is the first real encounter, if you will, with kind of radical Islam, if that's the polite way to put it, or impolite way to put it. But Islamism, I guess, is another way to say it, which becomes an ideology, certainly, that the U.S. has struggled with over the past 40 years. The fact that it's occurring in an area, in a region of vital strategic importance for the United States, in the mixture of what's going on with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of '79, a month after the hostages are taken. I mean, this really leads to a kind of an inflection and a crisis point in U.S. foreign policy, that Carter finally gets tough on the Soviets, and he begins to realize the threats going forward, which kind of paves the way for Reagan, who inherits those tough policies in 1980 and deals, and it makes it easier for him to kind of take the hard line towards the Soviets at that point.
So when does the Khomeini regime, so to speak, take power in Iran, and what were the factors that led from that to the storming of the embassy and the taking of the hostages?
So I think if I remember correctly, the Shah had been battling cancer for quite a while and in secret. And I guess from what I understand about this in Iranian society, to kind of reveal an illness among a leader is a sign of weakness. So he hid it from individuals in his own, except for individuals in his own coterie, but from the public. The protests begin to mount even further in the late 70s. Some of this is driven by economic dislocation, poverty. Some of it's driven by radicalism on both the extreme left, the communists, as well as the extreme right, I guess, in the Islamic student movement, who's protesting the Shah and his secret police. You have a really young population, which adds to this kind of mentality. I mean, that's always important to kind of realize. The demographics in Iran, the youth population was very big, teenager as well as college age young people. And so this feeds into that dynamic as well. And Ayatollah Khomeini inspires those young people more than any other person in Iran. So the Shah is ill. He's under pressure to reform. The United States finally, I think it's Ambassador William Sullivan, actually presses the Shah to seek reforms. But by the time he announces that he will seek some reforms and allow for greater human rights and the like, it's too late. And I think he's forced to flee the country in January or February of 1979. So it's a little while before the hostages are taken. And famously, then Khomeini flies back from Paris and basically declares Sharia law to be in place and declares an Islamic Republic. And he basically assumes power with the prime minister, with a government. But the real person in power is, of course, Khomeini himself behind the scenes.
So if Khomeini has been in power at this point for close to a year, what is it that really sends things? What's the chain of events that literally brings on the storming of the embassy in November?
Well, I think it's the more radical student faction and the continued support, at least, that the United States gives to the Shah himself. So the Shah is homeless for a while. He goes to Egypt, I think, initially first. I think he goes to, I want to say, Tunisia, somewhere in North Africa. But eventually his cancer worsens and he's invited into the United States to seek treatment. Carter, in that sense, fulfilling his obligations to an ally, regardless of the international situation involved with doing so, humanely invites the Shah in. I think he stays in Los Angeles area for a while seeking treatment. That's one thing. In reaction to kind of further increases of protests at the embassy and anti-Americanism, Carter also begins to cut off, I think, supplies to Iran, as well as after the embassy seizure, he freezes Iranian assets. That's a separate after event. But relations are worsening as the support for the Shah increasingly leads Khomeini and his regime to declare the United States the Great Satan. I mean, we're the consumerist, society, and in the 70s, of course, what's to them, it's decadence of what's going on in the Western world. So, I mean, it's a fitting kind of motif. And going back, it's 53. I mean, Iranians have long memories, which the U.S. doesn't, about what happened in 1953. And the United States most Americans don't know about that or had forgotten it by then.
Excuse me. I mean, I've read one of Khomeini's statements from 1979, or it may have even been early 1980. And what I was struck by, of course, I was expecting the stuff about the United States being the Great Satan. Which was a little more surprising was the way he denounced, although it wasn't as much, he didn't give nearly as much attention to it, but he denounces the Soviet Union and communism, but he also denounces nationalism of the sort that was being practiced, among most Arab leaders, most notably at this time, Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
And Sadat and others. I mean, and then think about what had occurred just a year earlier with the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. I mean, this also fuels, certainly, maybe helps inspire some of the radical Islamist movements to seize power. A couple of years later, in 81, Sadat would be assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So, I mean, you have this string of events which is occurring in the midst of how nation states typically had dealt with this in the Cold War, which is moving across the boundaries of nationhood and in the spread of kind of whether he's Shia or Sunni Islamist radicalism in the Middle East begins to grow and fester in that period of time. And for the United States, not really consumed with Middle Eastern politics. I mean, we would get introduced to this with Iran, I guess. I guess the world would be introduced to it at the Munich Olympics in '72, but that was a secular group, Black September, which was affiliated with the PLO and backed by the Soviet Union, not, a Muslim radical group like the Shah or like the Khomeini or like the Hezbollah in 1983 who blows up the Marine barracks in Lebanon. I mean, that's what's becoming more of a story, but it's buried because what's the real issue is still the Cold War and the end game with Gorbachev and Reagan in the 1980s.
Yeah, this is so fascinating because, of course, Islamism is such a well-established part of the international climate these days. Recent events going on in Gaza, right, or point to that. But here it is just starting to appear on the radar of American policymakers and them trying to figure it out.
And I don't think the CIA probably doesn't have enough. Certainly, probably, if you think back in Vietnam, I mean, how many people the CIA had working Vietnam in the late 50s and early 60s? And we kind of bungle our way into that conflict without knowing a lot about the region, the people, the history. Similarly, I guess, I'm sure we had plenty of people operating in the CIA in Iran. We had an Iranian desk, but were they focusing on Islamic kind of radicalism? Probably not as much as they could have been or should have been. I mean, there's mixed evidence about that. In the White House, you had Gary Sick, who was the National Security Council expert on Iran, who was advising Carter about this. I think William Sullivan, the ambassador, was advising Carter about some of this in '79. But there's a lot of sense that, there's greater priorities, that this is going to be confined to Iran. And virtually, eventually, it explodes across the entire region, especially after the pullout of Afghanistan with this Taliban becoming established in the 90s and afterwards with Al-Qaeda's emergence as well.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government, and civics.
Hi, this is John Moser, chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. If you are an educator who teaches U.S. history, government, or politics, our program may be just what you've been looking for. Our approach is to emphasize primary sources, since we think the best way to study the past is to read the words of those who lived it. We have a distinguished faculty made up of professors from both Ashland University and from colleges and universities across the country. And they're not there to lecture to you. We think it's better to learn through conversation about the documents. Ours is a hybrid program with two different types of seminar. The first are our week-long intensive in-person courses during the summers on the beautiful campus of Ashland University. The second are our live synchronous online seminars offered throughout the year. So if you're a social studies teacher and you're looking to deepen your understanding of America's past and its politics, please check out the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do that by visiting tah.org/programs.
So take us to November 4th, 1979. What exactly happens?
Well, there have been protests outside the embassy for days before that, and encouraged, from what I recall, by Khomeini, who approved the seizure of the embassy. The students raid the embassy finally, catch the Marine guards off guard, who were in no way possible to resist the number of students who were coming into the embassy itself, and seize control of the embassy. They're, of course, looking for information. They're looking for paperwork. They're looking for all sorts of evidence about that could, pin on the United States and its treatment of Iran, because it's a revolutionary situation. I mean, this is the other part of the story that I guess catches the U.S. off guard. It's a revolutionary situation, but it's not a communist revolutionary situation. We had been better dealing with that, though not perfect in dealing with those sorts of situations, than this sort of situation. And
At least we knew what we were dealing with then.
yeah, we knew what we were dealing with, and it was Western, right? At least communism was a phenomenon of the West, and this is something totally different. And in all the areas of the Cold War, we had never dealt with the seizure of an embassy by a number of radical students who were pushed and emboldened to do this by the ruling cleric, not so much the regime, because I think the prime minister and a few of his cabinet members actually resign after the takeover of the embassy, because it's being pushed more. Iranian politics, from what I understand, I mean, we look to Iran and say it's a theocracy, and it is, because the imams and the people in power are really the theocrats who kind of dictate the rules, but it's an elected government, and a government that's duly elected by the people. And arguably, they have free elections, just like we have in the United States. Maybe not in that particular era, because Khomeini had so much power and so much influence over it. But the government resigns, or the prime minister does, and the students are encouraged to hold the embassy after November 4th of 79, and would hold it for 444 days until Reagan's inaugural.
This really seems like a critical point. We say, well, Iran did this, but it's not, we are accustomed to thinking of, when we say Iran, we mean the Iranian government. But in this case, this is happening. Well, the demarcation line is not particularly clear.
Right.
The way the Iranian government presented was, well, we can't control these guys. And it kind of looks dishonest, because wait a minute, how can you just allow this to happen in your country? But in a way, it's not even their country anymore, right? Khomeini's really running things.
Yeah, Khomeini's running things. It's a revolutionary situation that exists there. They're already, trying to put to death, try people who are loyal to the Shah, people who are loyal to the Americans. I mean, they're looking for people to kind of pin the blame on for Iran's troubles, to try them, maybe execute them outright. I mean, it's one of those situations that the U.S. finds itself, it's very difficult to handle, because who's in charge? Who made the decisions to take the embassy? Is there a student leader? I mean, I remember a decade and a half ago, when I think it was Ahmadinejad who was president of Iran. He was thought to have been one of the students who raided the embassy, but they could never really say for sure if he was. He was about that age. And he was pretty radical and talking, pretty strong anti-American rhetoric as elected president of Iran, and had good relations with the imams in power, basically above them, who dictate everything else. I mean, we hear the rhetoric coming from Iran even today, certainly the rhetoric since October 7th about the Hamas incident. And of course, Iran supports Hamas, they support Hezbollah, they support the Houthis in Yemen, all of these groups that are trying to undermine and destroy Israel and impact U.S. interests in the Middle East, no doubt. We're still technically, you can say, at war with Iran almost 40 some years later, after the seizure of the embassy.
So let's talk about the U.S. response to this. Hostages have been taken. You mentioned the freezing of Iranian assets in the United States. This clearly puts Carter in a difficult situation at a time when his presidency already seems kind of shaky.
Yeah, if you think about the wider problems for Carter by 1979, the inflation issue is immense. He had done the right thing and appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, who basically has the policies that would eradicate inflation, but that means driving up interest rates so high that it forces a recession. That's a bad thing to run on in 1980. A month and a half, Christmas Day of 79, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So the whole Middle East seems to be erupting in chaos, and Carter gets tough. Like I said, he freezes Iranian assets. There's no spare parts for Iranian planes, for instance, that are sent. Those assets would be unfrozen by Obama years later, but the Iranian assets. But he takes a hard line but he's not going to try to, he tries to negotiate an end to the Iranian hostage crisis, but he fails to bring about any resolve in this. And with the economy sinking, with the sense that America's best days are behind it, kind of fighting the Vietnam malaise and the like in 1979 and into 1980 in the campaign, Carter becomes kind of a hostage to events in Iran. And he kind of makes himself a hostage to events. You know, he tries a rescue mission in April of 1980. I think it's Operation Eagle Claw, which seems kind of absurd that you're going to land these troops in the desert, what about 15 miles outside of Tehran, and they're going to go in, storm into the embassy, take the hostages, and go out back to the helicopters and fly out. That was the Army Special Forces, and you were going to do this and bring the hostages out. But the desert sands get into the rotors, and a couple helicopters crash, and they kill, I think, a dozen or fewer troops in the Iranian desert. His popularity polls go up after that because at least he's taking action.
Right.
But at the same time, Carter's facing potentially a very conservative anti-communist who's talking tough, Ronald Reagan, who wins the nomination in the summer of 1980. And go ahead, John.
When you talk about the negotiations failing, what's the substance of those negotiations? What do the students occupying the embassy want? What's their end game, I guess?
I think the end game, I don't know I can't remember exactly what the demands are. I think they demand the Shah be returned for one, for trial. The Shah dies in the process of that year. I mean, he doesn't outlive the hostages returning to the United States. They demand the restoration of the Shah's assets and everything, the frozen assets. That becomes an issue if I remember correctly. But the return of the Shah is the number one issue initially, and for trial. But I think the Shah dies in the spring or summer of 1980, if I'm not mistaken. And this is something that then the continuation of the holding of the hostages just is a good kind of, for them, a showcase of American weakness. So why wouldn't you continue to hold initially 66 and then 54 hostages? Because 12 are freed. Some of the women who were taken hostage are freed, as well as some African Americans who were freed, ostensibly because, from what I understand, that Khomeini was at least knowledgeable about the racial issue in America and felt that freeing the African Americans could help, gain support among African Americans for what Khomeini was doing, or, for Iran in this thing. I don't know if it did. I don't think it did. But 54 hostages are held for most of that period of time. And it becomes a symbol of, more or less a symbol of, American weakness in 1980, which Reagan capitalizes on. And Carter, like I said, takes, after the Eagle Claw operation throughout the summer, the Democratic convention's pretty lackluster because Carter's renominated. It kind of reminds me of Hoover in 1932 in a way.
Ted Kennedy's challenging him, or challenged him for the nomination.
In the primaries. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he does okay, but Carter winds up winning actually relatively easily. But Kennedy gives his famous speech at the convention, which seems to rally the more progressive forces in the Democratic Party. But Carter's really taking a bunker mentality throughout the fall. He doesn't campaign very much. The economy is worsening. Everything's kind of coming to a head in the fall of 1980, and Reagan would win relatively easily that year, talking tough about not negotiating for the return of the hostages. And it just so happens that the hostages are set free on January of 1981 and Reagan's inauguration.
Yeah, this is something I want to talk about more. I seem to remember a joke went around that was something like, "What's flat and glows?" Iran after Ronald Reagan is elected president.
Yeah, doesn't happen, does it?
So
Reagan would struggle through the 80s with his own hostage taking issues, right? And eventually, Hezbollah would take Americans hostage in Lebanon throughout the 1980s, and Reagan's, of course, official policy is you don't negotiate with terrorists who take hostages.
Right.
But unofficially, Reagan's troubled by this, and so troubled by it, he looks for an avenue to approach Iran, which is now by 1980 to 88 fighting a brutal war with Iraq for supremacy there. And Reagan, unfortunately, goes so far as to at least encourage some of his lower level figures to trade arms for hostages. I mean, Reagan himself is not involved in that, but that decision making, but his instincts about the people being kept captive, being freed, are no different than Carter's, right? The humane instinct that you want Americans out of there, and that means negotiating with them in the end. Maybe that's the best path forward.
Yeah. So the hostages are freed the day that Ronald Reagan is inaugurated in January of 1981. You mentioned Gary Sick earlier.
Yeah,
he comes out with a book called October Surprise that claims that the Reagan campaign was secretly working with the Iranians to delay the release of the hostages until he became president. What do you think of that theory? Is there anything to it?
From what I understand, there's been nothing that's been proven to that theory. I guess the closest thing that I've seen to that kind of idea is similar to Richard Nixon talking to the South Vietnamese government about accepting the terms in 1968, and that's been now debunked. Doesn't happen as much as what the claim was. In other words, don't negotiate a truce with Johnson in power until I'm president. Basically, it was Nixon's working through Claire Chenot, who I think was the mediary there. From what I understand, there has been no evidence of Sick's claims being proven, but it becomes a hotbed issue, of course, throughout the 1980s that the Reagan campaign made a deal with the mullahs in Iran to free the hostages. Possibly it had run its course by then. Possibly they were fearful of Reagan's, what Reagan might do. There's all sorts of ways to kind of spin this. If you do a counterfactual and say, what if they had continued to hold the hostages? What would Reagan have done? What were his options? They're no better than Carter's. Could you, I like the joke about flattening Iran. I remember it. But would he have done that? Probably not.
No.
And the problem is for American presidents like Reagan, as I said, he faces his own hostage issues and comes across just as impotent in some respects about dealing with it, because what can you do when they're holding citizens hostage?
So we're close to the end of our time. What have been the longer term implications of the Iranian hostage crisis?
So I think in one respect you see it today. I mean, so you see Iran as one of the key powers in the region who's seeking regional dominance in the Middle East. And sometimes the U.S. responds fairly effectively against Iran and containing that or challenging, pushing back on it. In other cases, I think in both the presidency of Obama and Biden, an attempt to kind of get them to move away from building nuclear weapons and giving them money back and paying for hostages, which Biden just did and continues to support Iran. That just kind of continues, I think, the view that the Iranian mullahs have that the Americans are weak, that decadent Western culture has to go. Now they've been pushed into this, I wouldn't say axis. Some people are claiming with Putin and with Xi Jinping, but certainly, there's interest there that these three regimes have in common to thwart Western power and especially American power. Iran is continued to be, I think, the major problem in the Middle East. And there is no real living with that regime as it wants to spread Islamism throughout the region. It wants to challenge Saudi Arabian power, which it's doing in a conflict in Yemen, for instance, supporting the Houthis there against a Saudi-backed force. I mean, we have proxy wars in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia now. It certainly celebrated the Hamas attacks recently in October. much like American college students, it seems. And so in that sense, the Iranian situation continues to fester and continues to be a problem some 43 years later.
Wow. So yeah, once again, we see that what events that seem like a long time ago continue to have echoes to today's international climate and to today's national interest. Greg Schneider, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
And I want to thank all of our listeners, and we'll see you next time on The American Idea.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.